posting the video last time. I think I mentioned in the message, our power went out shortly after class last week. A tornado touched down a couple miles from here, and our power was out until late on Sunday. So it took a while. Our session was recorded on this computer, but I had no power on this computer until Sunday afternoon. That'll really get your attention when you lose all the stuff in the freezer and the fridge. I'm sure you guys have been there too, and been through that experience. But we're back to normal, or as normal as we ever get now at this particular point. So let's think about distance education, teaching and learning at a distance. Michael Simonson, one of the things he led off with in this first chapter is talking about some conflicting wishes from students engaged in distance education, conflicting pressures for people who would offer distance education, like say a board of education or perhaps a university. What are those two pressures, and what are the implications for institutions that might want to make use of distance ed?
Well, if we're talking about the situations, let's see, there's, if it's onto this, is the students who like to teach, who like to learn more in the classroom, but still want the opportunity to work online, which then sounds like it's very confusing as to what to do when you're getting
yes, they want both. I mean, they want the option of learning in the classroom, and they want the option of learning at a distance. And given their druthers, other things being equal, they'll pick the classroom one. But other things are not always equal, as you guys know, as you are currently engaged in distance education. Notice that article I sent you a few days ago from the Chronicle of Higher Education. I sent it out in an announcement, the one that said online and hybrid learning are increasingly popular. Now colleges have to keep up. Let's take Simonson and that initial thought from Simonson about students wanting both of those things, and this article from the Chronicle this past week. What does that mean for you if you are a university or you're perhaps a board of education in a public school district? What are the implications?
I think they're going to have to offer that, offer another option for people that want to learn through distance learning. They're going to have to get their teachers trained and pay to have the teachers trained. And
you're saying something important here. You're saying they might have to pay for some stuff that they have not been paying for previously, at a time when most institutions seem to be saying that their budgets are, shall we say, problematic. WVU seems to be making reference to a $45 million structural deficit, I believe is the vocabulary they're using, at a time when these pressures seem to be demanding that they offer not only what they have traditionally offered in terms of face-to-face instruction, but also hybrid and distance learning options, which, Joy, as you are correct in suggesting, means, well, if you're going to do that, you're going to need some training, right, for the people who are going to be delivering this. And that's not all you're going to need. What are you going to need besides training?
Invest in the technology.
That's going to be one of them. Yeah, there's equipment you're going to have to buy. There's going to be hardware. There's going to be software. What else are you going to need? I know we're leaping ahead. We get into this later in the semester, but let's think about it.
Maybe then you have to hire people to train your people.
Well, perhaps. I mean, either permanently or temporarily, one way or another, you're going to have to get the professional development somewhere, and it's not usually free.
I think the teachers are going to have enough time to get it set up, like get their lessons planned and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, as some of you have already learned, you can't be told on Friday that as of Monday you're going distant and just do it properly. You're going to need time to develop and implement properly. What else are you going to need?
Just a question in this: is this something that seems like it's going to only affect higher education, or are they looking at it affecting, I guess, the high school or or younger.
Well, you tell me, are you seeing the K-12 environment where you are making any use of either hybrid or distance delivery?
Only during COVID.
Okay, so you saw it during COVID.
During COVID, yeah. Or
I
I'm
know
gonna take that
our
back.
school,
Or if there's like a snow day,
Okay,
they
so
might
there's
say,
two
hey, we're gonna go.
examples.
Yeah, I guess
Snow
that's just
days.
me.
Any other examples?
I know our school district, I live in PA, but
Mhm.
they have to provide that opportunity now. The
Okay,
school district where I live, they have to supply that need for distance education to anyone that wants to do it, and it's
okay.
paid
So there's
for.
an example of a K-12 public district
Mhm.
providing that. Not that I like, by the way, Florida, I do not like to hold up Florida as an educational example at present for reasons that you probably know about. But Florida has an entire separate school district online. They have all the counties and some cities, plus they have an online district. So in answer to your question, Melissa, in many cases, yeah, K-12 as well. Now, whether it's a good fit or not is a whole separate question, which we can get into later. But are some K-12 institutions delivering it that way? Yeah, with all the attendant balancing act to be done, the resources needed to do it well, and the implications of doing it. By the way, when it talks about online and hybrid delivery there, how do you tell the difference? I mean, what's an online course versus a hybrid course versus a web facilitated course?
I mean, I feel a hybrid is when you still meet in person, but then you have to do some tasks online, or maybe even, let's say it was a 3-day-a-week class, that like 2 days you'd meet in person, and then the third day you meet online. That's kind of where I'm
What
going
about a
with it.
class that only meets in person twice a semester? Does everything else online?
I don't. I feel like that's beyond
One of the
hybrid.
IDT classes falls into that category.
I think it would technically count as hybrid, but I think what they're doing when they meet would factor. Like if they're just coming together to talk or for a lecture, but if they're coming together to work on something to collaborate, I think that would be a fair definition of hybrid learning.
Do we have any criteria out there from anywhere that one might use rather than sort of a general feel about, gee, we do most of our stuff online, or gee, we do most of our stuff in person and a little bit online?
Didn't they say there's not much of a consensus about?
Yeah, there's not a fine consensus. It's not that we've got it nailed down all the way around the edges, but we do have some criteria from some places that are at least defensible. For example, your textbook cited an organization called the Sloan Consortium, which is I don't know what to call it exactly, kind of a research slash learned society organization in the field of educational technology. They do a lot of gathering data and reporting out to institutions on what's the current state of the discipline. They have some criteria that was cited in your textbook there, if you noticed, that for the Sloan Consortium, if at least 80% of the content of a course is delivered online, they call it online. So they're saying, okay, four-fifths or more, it's online. So that puts this course into that category, online. And I said hybrid, well, 30 to 79%, kind of that middle chunk is hybrid. So a little less than half to a little more than half of the stuff delivered online, hybrid for Sloan. And then web facilitated is a course that uses some stuff on the web, but less than 30% of what they actually do is done online. So the implication there is mostly in person with a little bit of stuff on the side on the web there. But you're right. No, there isn't a consensus. There's not, for example, a federal definition of what constitutes an online class that might be used in a court somewhere for those particular purposes. One of the things that Simonson talks quite a bit about in this chapter is the idea that we have research. We actually have a lot of research on distance education going back decades. He talks about we have research that distance education can be as effective as traditional education. Remember that equivalency principle that we hit on last week? That there is the potential for distance education to be as effective as. He mentions some underlying principles, though, that are important when considering that principle. Sort of, I think of them as caveats. It's actually on page 8 in your textbook there. He says there's some things that have to be true in order for distance education to realize its potential to be as effective as face-to-face. You know, he talks about things like training and design and support systems. He's got 8 of them there on page 8. My question for you, given the things he's saying, look, if distance education is going to be equally effective compared to face-to-face, these principles need to be honored in the case of distance education. Which of these principles have been honored in your own experience or not? And what have been the identifiable consequences of having them honored or perhaps not honored, depending on your experience?
In my experience, I felt I had a little bit of each of them, but the most one I had available were support systems.
Mhm.
Meaning that I was in a county where we were full one-on-one iPad Apple products. So we had our own Apple team and that were and our own tech team and everything. They were trained in Schoology and the learning systems we use, as well as all Apple products. So they
Mhm.
showed us all different things we could do for the remote learning, the different systems we could use, and the little tips and tricks. So we had
And
a
what were the
support system.
consequences of that as you experienced them since you had that available to you?
Positive consequences. I mean, it gave me a lot of ideas on things to do, but I also felt very overwhelmed because there wasn't really any training on how to teach remotely. It was more guidelines such as
How to
we
use the
had to give.
software as opposed to how to teach. How to
Oh, I'm
use the
sorry.
software as how to use the software as opposed to how to teach with the software. Is that what you're describing?
The guidelines.
No, the training that you got.
Oh, the training. Yes, it was more things that were available to us with the software, like specific apps, cool Apple tricks, or things in Schoology, which could be great for some things, but as far as
It wasn't
training,
really knitted together into pedagogy. It was
no.
sort of pieces rather than a picture assembled from the pieces.
Mhm.
Okay. So you would see the positive, I think you saw some positive consequences of that from what you were saying. And you also saw some negative consequences of that in the sense that you hadn't had the opportunity to be trained how to teach with those things. You did, in fact, learn how to do those things, but it was more of a struggle to figure out now, what do I do with my students now that I know how to do
Yes.
those things with the technology? Okay. How about the rest of you guys? I mean, that's a good example, Savannah, of the pluses and minuses of what Simonson is talking about here as underlying principles.
Well, I've had, because I got my whole master's online. When it comes to interaction, as I feel, I mean, there hasn't been, I think, a single online class I didn't have that there wasn't at least a weekly discussion in between students, with sometimes the instructor chiming in, sometimes not. And the assessments were pretty similar, but um, a lot of them were lacking a support system. And one thing I'm actually going through this semester is I have a teacher that uses eCampus, Google Classroom, and Packback that I hadn't heard before. And it's like, geez, what's like, what am I opening every day? And I actually teased him and said, I'm like, why aren't you just doing this all on eCampus? And he's like, the eCampus, he's like, it's not that great. And I was like, why don't you try to learn? I'm like, this is so confusing. Why are you doing this? And I've had, and I think I talked about it last semester. The other online class I had last semester was I could have been taught by a robot. He had no presence whatsoever, never answered a question. I felt the design was so confusing. It was so hard to find things. But when I did IMC, they did have like a formula that everybody had to follow. It's just some teachers were engaged more than other teachers, and some, just did the bare bones of what they were told, and others went a little bit above and beyond to
You're getting at the distinction there between design and delivery, which is sometimes done by entirely different people. It's one thing to set up a class and structure it and put all the pieces together in a particular way, and it's another thing entirely to be in the discussions, posting announcements, being in Zoom sessions, answering student questions, sending out emails, responding to student emails. Totally different function. So, and both of those are significant aspects of distance education here. So I think I hear you saying, Melissa, that you have experienced a number of negative aspects from some of these principles not being honored. You found lack of support systems to be problematic and very confusing for you as a student trying to navigate there. You found lack of good design to be very confusing for you as a student and caused you to spend a lot of energy on something other than mastering the content of the class, which is that's when something has clearly gone off the rails. The idea is to make the medium as transparent as possible. Students have a finite capacity to do stuff. I mean, look up, if you don't already know the term, look up the term cognitive load. In fact, I'll even put it in the chat there because I know people like to do Google searches on the side when we're doing these Zooms. The basic idea of cognitive load, to paraphrase it and oversimplify it a little bit, is that you've got a finite amount of horsepower in your head. And if you're using all that horsepower to try to figure out where was that discussion I'm supposed to answer by tonight, you don't have any horsepower left to think about the question you're supposed to be answering in the discussion. So the idea is to minimize the cognitive load that the design of the course imposes on a student so that they have the maximum amount of mental horsepower left to focus on math or chemistry or computer science or history of design or whatever it is that they're supposed to be mastering there. But one of the things that Simonson talks about is distance education as a disruptive technology. What does it mean when it describes distance ed as a disruptive technology? It's interesting. People's answers to this have really changed since the pandemic.
It causes a big change, or it replaces or alters the standard or more common choice.
Yeah. All of the above. And everybody experienced that at the time of the pandemic, right? Everybody as a student or as an instructor or both went through that a couple of years ago, and they thought, whoa, my whole educational life is disrupted. I can't do anything the way I've been doing stuff. I have to do everything differently. Yeah, and that's kind of the core of what makes a disruptive technology. He talked about the technology being on a continuum, a spectrum, if you will. And he gave some other examples. What was the other end of the continuum from disruptive for him when he was talking about that? Disruptive as opposed to...
Sustaining?
Yeah, sustaining. What would be an example of a sustaining technology?
No, he used the example of a smart board, although I don't know that much about a smart board, but that was one he gave in the text.
Okay, but you know what a smart board is, right? I mean, you've encountered them. You would recognize one if you saw one in a dark alley somewhere in use, right? And say, oh, that's a smart board. So what is it? What is it about a smart board that makes him call it a sustaining as opposed to a disruptive technology? Why would a smart board not be a disruptive technology like distance education?
Maybe because it's like a little bit of an improvement on the blackboard or a whiteboard, like it's not that much different.
If you were a Blackboard or whiteboard user prior to that time and you suddenly get a smart board in your classroom, you're not forced to do anything significantly differently than you were doing with the Blackboard or the whiteboard. I mean, yes, a smart board can do other stuff, granted, but if you've just got a new smart board, you can keep writing stuff up there on the board with your marker just the way you did before. it sustains older ways of doing things and lets you make a gradual transition if you want to something newer. Whereas distance education, there's pretty much no way to call that a sustaining technology. There's no way to keep doing things just like you were before with that particular technology. One of the things that he talks about later in that chapter, it's page 22 if you have your textbook around there, he talks about a couple of scenarios for distance education. He talks about one for schools, he talks about one for business and industry. Um, how closely do those scenarios match what you've seen in this pandemic era? He wrote this before the pandemic. So now that we've had everybody dive into distance education, for better or worse, how close to match are those scenarios for what you've seen?
I think the work scenario wasn't that far off from what we currently have, where you talk about Zoom meetings and
Yeah,
people
work
working
from
in
home.
different spaces and stuff like that, for sure.
Yeah,
But
he
the other
nailed
one
he nailed
was,
it.
yeah,
The other one.
the other
Talk
one,
about the other one.
I don't think so. I mean, they talk about like schools being open 24 hours a day and open to the community for learning. And I haven't seen that, at least where I live. I don't know if other people have, but it just seems like it's pretty much the same as it's always been for the most
I'm
part where I live.
I'm going to comment about saying the schools are open 24 hours, showing my age when I went back to school the second time, having a training on how to use the WVU library website. And the fact that I could access a book 24 hours a day online, not have to be super lazy and not walk to the library. I feel that that was 24-hour access to at least reading materials. And I'm still even at the point now that I'm amazed at how much information that I can just get from the library that they put on for me to be able to download and not have to buy a book or not
Okay,
have
so
to pay for
in that
something.
particular sense, you gained access to materials, potentially learning materials 24/7 that you did not have previously. So it's a step in that direction. Now, but and I think I know what you're reacting to, Joy, which is he was describing in here the whole idea that the actual schools themselves and their equipment and everything else would be available at any time for anybody in the community, which I'm thinking is what you're not seeing. I'm not seeing either in my particular community. Now, step back a little bit. Let's think about that scenario that he's got there for schools, and think about what we talked about last week with John Seeley Brown and learning ecologies. Similar or different from what Simonson is describing here?
I think it's similar, like where,
Okay.
because it was talking about in that thing that the community could learn from each other. Students are connected to the teachers and resources through a network. The internet was available for everyone, which, that's not necessarily true. But a learning ecology is where you learn from different people in your community and of similar interests and stuff. So in that way, I think it's related.
Yeah, I think he's describing something pretty similar to what John Seeley Brown was talking about. It's noteworthy that at least in the K-12 context, that is exactly what has not been implemented in the case of distance education. In fact, that in many ways, it seems as though schools, K-12 schools, have worked very hard to treat distance education as a sustaining technology rather than a disruptive one, to figure out how can we continue doing ways exactly as we've done them before and do them at a distance, which is precisely wrong. That's how you don't honor the equivalency principle that distance education can be as effective as face-to-face. So one of the things that's going to turn out to be true as we work our way through the semester is that good distance education, by definition, pretty much, doesn't look a lot like face-to-face. Good distance education is somewhat disruptive compared to what we've been used to historically as far as face-to-face classroom education. Let's switch over to Stephen Brown for Stephen Johnson for a little bit here. one of the things that he talks about in this chapter, and one of the things you're probably noticing about Stephen Johnson now that we've gone from an introduction into a chapter, and something that you're really going to notice as we go through later chapters, is that he bounces around a lot. One of his specialties is history of science, and science is a really big area. So he has a tendency to bounce from one discipline to another when he's describing things, and then to tie the ideas together. One of the things he talks about is the development of the neo-nurture incubator. What was that, and what was the point he was trying to make in talking about an incubator for premature babies?
It was an incubator made out of car parts
Yeah,
for
there's an incubator
developing
made out of
countries.
car parts for developing countries. Why?
To use the resources they had and the resources that the locals had knowledge of, so they could actually keep these things up and running and take care of them when there were problems.
Exactly that. So they could do what they could with what they had where they were at that particular time to maximize the benefit of that. Good ideas for Stephen Johnson, a point that he'll make over and over again, are constrained by the parts and the skills that surround them. Good ideas are creatures of their time and place. What do we know right now? What equipment do we have right now? What's our setting right now? To pick one particular example for West Virginia, since we're a West Virginia University class, bandwidth is a huge constraint for much of West Virginia with respect to distance education. All of you are familiar with areas where you can't get on reliably, stay online reliably, and bring down high bandwidth information like video at a high speed. All of you know of situations where you can't assume that for students. So good ideas must be implementable in real life. And in the case of the neo-nurture incubator, it was implementable in real life in areas that had very limited resources in a number of different ways. Now, think about bricolage. What's bricolage again? One of the things John Seeley Brown sometimes.
I also found like it's something building something with the parts that you have around.
Yeah, it's sort of making it work from what you got. Bricolage is often about assembling slightly unexpected, dissimilar components into something functional. Think about if that's one of the changes taking place right now in learners, which John Seeley Brown suggested, right? He was suggesting 21st century learners are going to become more comfortable and more competent in the area of bricolage. Are we seeing those kinds of unexpected juxtapositions in popular culture in other ways? If you think about it's 2023. Where do you see unexpected things being put together culturally? Joy, you're not going swimming, you're coming inside.
No, I got cold.
Social media,
Well, say more.
that count?
I don't know. It depends on what you have in mind. It's not necessarily a short answer question. I mean, I can think of
I don't know what I
It's a
have in
treat.
mind. um, Collaborators, different peoples, meshing of ideas, working
You're
together to
going in a
build on
constructive
things.
direction here. What are some specific places where you've seen that?
Reddit. A lot of my crafting groups, gardening groups.
Okay, now think about picking two dissimilar ones. Let me give you one example that I can think of, just as kind of a lead off. Think about music. So these may not be musical examples you're familiar with. I don't know, but if you think about a band like Brass Against, they combine New Orleans style jazz instrumentation with protest music from Rage Against the Machine. Two very dissimilar things put together, and they actually make it work very well. Or the Wagaki band, which does Japanese folk heavy metal, two very dissimilar things put together and made to work. Are there places that you see those kinds of unexpected juxtapositions? Not necessarily music, but think
Yeah.
art, think food, think politics. Are there specific places where you're seeing that in culture around us today?
Mm. Well, you're speaking of music, it made me think, I didn't remember what bands, but my husband and his friends, they're really into these rock bands that do country music covers,
Okay, there you go.
heavy death metal versions.
Okay, that's a good example. Or flip it the other way. Steven Seagal's does sort of hillbilly versions of heavy metal tunes. It's the same kind of very unexpected combo. I'm glad your dog is with us, Joy. Good to see.
Well, when I came inside, he hopped outside. So that's why I had to walk away a minute to bring him inside because he's so little.
Yeah.
I'm afraid the hawks will get him.
He's welcome
Thank you.
to be with us. What other examples can you come up with? You don't see it as much in West Virginia, but you guys are plugged into the world at large. What would you see if you were in the big city, or hear or taste if you were in the big city? Last time I was in DC, I had Korean barbecue tacos. To me, that was a real
Last year they had a restaurant called Chabang,
okay.
which was Mexican and Asian mixed together somehow.
There's an example for you. See, we're starting to get that collision of cultures putting together unexpected things and making them work kind of idea. That's bricolage is not really intended to apply to music or food, but the concept is legitimate in that particular context. It's making things work when they're assembled from unexpected combinations. And it's a talent, it's a skill. Melissa, what were you about to say?
Have you seen the videos where somebody would repair wood or furniture by dumping ramen in it and using
No.
that as the base?
No, but that's a good example.
There's these videos where that you're going to fix a hole and you just fill it with ramen and then go over time. There's a bunch of it's really, really weird. But the thing I was thinking about before that popped in my head, which I always take it a little bit more of an artsy way, but I've seen some people actually use actual Legos to fill in places where bricks and I'm not going to say whole building, something that doesn't, it's not massively structural. So, but using that to fill something in, I guess that's where my mind is a filler to fix holes in a unique way.
Yeah. I had a zipper pull give out on a pair of pants, and I ran across a video teaching me how to get rid of the old pull and repair it by using a combination of a paperclip thread, baking soda, and super glue. But it turns out if you mix baking soda and super glue, it forms kind of a plastic. So you can make a new zipper pull out of the paperclip, wrap thread around it to give it kind of a rough, holdable surface. And then you put super glue and baking soda on it to coat it basically with plastic. So you now have a plastic zipper pull. That's bricolage.
That's a first.
Think of it
as like a science project.
Well, yeah, but think of it not so much in concrete terms, like repairing a zipper pull or patching a hole in your wall, but think of it conceptually. When you start encountering lots of ideas and unexpected sources on the internet, and you start figuring out how these unexpected ideas fit together, that's what John Seely Brown is really talking about with bricolage, getting good at making dissimilar things fit together and work in unexpected ways. One of the things Stephen Johnson talks about is this idea, and you'll hear it over and over again this semester, of the adjacent possible. What's the adjacent possible?
possibilities of what may come or what could be created.
Okay, say
What we
more.
have,
What's the adjacent part? Because it's an important idea here. You're on the right track.
we're near, but we're not there.
Say more. Yeah. You're warm.
The
You're looking
shadow
good.
of the future, like we see where we can go and what we can do, but we have to get there. Or the new technologies or new concepts, or
Okay.
I'm having trouble explaining it.
Now you're definitely in the right territory here. Melissa sent
Like
us
what
a
we have
link to a
now.
video of something.
Oh, okay.
That's, you can watch
I'm
that
not going to
later
watch the video.
on how
I'm
to
not going
fix
to
your
watch the
sink with
video.
ramen.
Okay.
On how to fix
We'll
your
watch
sink
the
with
ramen
ramen.
video
I had to
later.
say.
But for now, let's stick with the adjacent possible. Joy, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think it's more like if you have a current technology, but there's other things possible with that technology related to that, or like kind of like the next step.
You're both you and Savannah are definitely in the right territory here. Yeah, you're right. I don't know, next to the bullseye, for lack of a better description.
I have an example, but it's already passed. It's like this has already happened, but I think about it because it was affecting me in my career. When I was a dental hygienist, I mean, for years and years, you took x-rays with traditional film. And then we had a time that they figured out how to do digital x-rays. They're very expensive. And
so pause for just a second here, and then we'll continue your example. But let's just talk just a little bit more about what you've said so far. Back up, I don't know, a couple decades, 20, 30 years, something like that. Think about photography in general, how we took pictures. And I know some of you are young enough that you may not remember taking many pictures with film, but you're at least aware of film cameras, right? At that particular time, late 20th century, any kind of picture you took with film, you developed it with chemicals, you got a negative, you printed the negative to a positive, and then you had a photograph. And that had been the model for 150 years at that particular point. So along comes this new technology, part of computer technology, digital photography. But the thing about digital photography when it was young is it was really crude. If you looked at the early digital cameras, the pictures were very blocky or very fuzzy. They didn't have a high level of detail. You could take digital pictures and you didn't have to develop them chemically. You could just put them up on a screen, but they weren't very good pictures. But people saw that and said, whoa, that's magic. You don't have to do the chemicals. You don't have to do the prints. The pictures are terrible. But if we could just improve the technology, we could. And they started thinking that's the adjacent possible, that, ooh, here's the germ of a new thing. If we can refine this, there's a whole bunch of new stuff we could do. And one of those new things was we could do it with x-rays. We could take all that film that the dentists have been developing, and instead of having to do the chemicals in the dark room, they could take the pictures and flash them up above their patient right there in the chair. It would be magic, but we can't do it yet. It's 1990 and the resolution isn't good enough and it doesn't work with x-rays. But as digital cameras improve and they extend them to things like x-rays, it became possible, right? It moved from the adjacent possible, the ooh, we could, if we could just take this technology we've got and improve it, we could go to this next level. And everybody in the dentist chair could just see all the x-ray data up there. It would be great. Adjacent possible is the next thing that becomes possible when something new comes into view. And that's a terrific example you gave that you lived through, Melissa. You used to develop those, right, as a dental hygienist in the darkroom? And now you're one of the people who doesn't have to go in there and mess with the chemicals. You can just make sure the right thing happens on the keyboard. And there's the teeth up there. Well, you don't do that anymore, but you
and the great
gained
thing
the
is,
ability to do that.
We used to have them where you would have a magnifying glass to look at it, and now you
Yeah.
take pictures, you just blow them up. And
Zoom.
I've known dentists are just like, oh my God, It's like I can
Yeah.
see so much more on X-rays. I think Joy needs to chime in since she does radiology. How
Well,
my
yeah, I mean,
sister only learned digital. She didn't do it. Even though I don't want to be dipping a chest
well, you're
X-ray.
going through that
I
right
don't know
now,
how
Joy,
they
aren't
did
you?
it.
I mean, aren't you going through a transition into fully digital radiology for a lot of the
Oh
work that
yeah,
you do?
the government won't reimburse if you have an office that only has film, the government will not reimburse
There you
with
go.
insurance fully. Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
have moved through what was probably, I'm guessing, and I don't know your age, so forgive me about inadvertently insulting, but I'm guessing that you have moved from a time when digital radiology was in the adjacent possible. You could sort of see it coming, but you couldn't really do it yet. I mean, you still had to use the older technology for now until the new technology got better, but it got better and better and better. And now you're describing a situation where it's not the adjacent possible anymore. It's not in the near future anymore. It's here and now. And if you want the government to give you your money back, you're going to do it this way. It's no
Right.
longer Jetsons stuff. It's just part of today's world. So the
Yes.
adjacent possible is that world of what's just across the border. What can we not quite do yet, but we can see it. You know, we can see it kind of dimly, kind of foggily, and we know we're moving in that direction. It will be possible soon. And it was made possible by something that was previously in the adjacent possible for something else. The adjacent possible is always moving. It's a moving boundary. You know, you stop and think about digital photography, for example. Um, and again, age may be an issue here. I don't know for some of these explanations, but nobody thought that something like this, well, hard to get it on camera, my phone, something like this, if you go back 25 years, go back 20 years, these didn't exist. And if you wanted to take pictures, you carried a camera. Now, previously, it had been a film camera. And by 25 years ago, you carried a digital camera. And people thought, cool, digital cameras, they're really small. They're little. I can tuck it in my pocket or my bag. Good deal. I'm looking at a world where digital cameras get even smaller and smaller and smaller. And they got so small, we started putting them in the same box with our music and our phone. You know, that the adjacent possible evolved over time till people could see, what if I combine a digital camera with something else? What if I combine a digital camera with the thing I use to play music? What if I combine all of those things with a telephone? What if I combine all of those things with a computer? What if I combine all of those things with the internet? The adjacent possible is stepping forward, moving continuously forward. Every time we get a new technology, the adjacent possible shifts. So, why is this relevant for distance education? This whole idea of the adjacent possible.
I think it's just going to keep improving. I think it's probably the way of the future for sure. And I think it's just, we're going to come up with new ideas, new ways to teach information in a better way all the time.
So,
That's
what we've got now in the form of the internet provides kind of a perfect environment for education, if you think about that. I mean, you're describing expanding horizons of education there when you talk about that, Joy. And also, there's a skills issue here because it takes certain skills to thrive in that kind of environment. The rules keep changing. Have you noticed? The interface keeps changing. The ways in which you use stuff, the ways in which you combine information from different sources changes over time. So, in order to be able to use it effectively, either as a teacher or a student, you have to have certain skills that allow you to master that changing environment in which education is happening, the evolving adjacent possible. That's where that bricolage comes in as part of your skill set that you need as a teacher or a student to cope with the changes in the adjacent possible. If you read Stephen Johnson, what kind of environment creates good ideas?
Open-minded one.
What does that mean?
Open to new ideas and concepts and um, willing to learn and engage in unfamiliar things.
Okay, those are good descriptors. Here's a quote from Stephen Johnson for you. I think it's on page 41, at least of my edition of Stephen Johnson. What kind of environment creates good ideas? The simplest way to answer it is this: innovative environments are better at helping their inhabitants explore the adjacent possible because they expose a wide and diverse sample of spare parts, mechanical or conceptual, and they encourage novel ways of recombining those parts. Environments that block or limit those new combinations by punishing experimentation, by obscuring certain branches of possibility, by making the current state so satisfying that no one bothers to explore the edges, will on average generate and circulate fewer innovations than environments that encourage exploration. To me, that says a lot about what distance education should be aspiring to over time. And again, you don't have to agree with me about these things, but one of my biases is that for distance education to be at its best, it should aspire to be a place where all of our students can have lots of good ideas and explore them and pursue them in whatever their particular domain is. You had a video that I asked you to ask here, to watch, from Michael Simonson. Simonson explains equivalency theory. Now, I know it's an old video. It was originally recorded on VHS, but equivalency theory hasn't changed, and the ideas haven't changed here. So what is equivalency theory?
If it's the more equivalent something is, the more effective it will be, which doesn't mean it has to be the same. It just has to follow, I guess, having the same end goal, but you don't have to get there the exact same way.
Okay, and that's an important part of it. What you're saying there, Melissa, is equivalent doesn't mean identical. Equivalent is not the same thing as equal, in the sense that distance education might provide lectures because face-to-face education provides lectures. That's not what equivalency theory means. Learning experiences are equivalent if they produce equivalent learning outcomes, but they may be very different learning experiences. It's the outcome that determines whether or not they're equivalent. The whole idea that Simonson is talking about is that you shouldn't expect everybody to learn the same way. You already knew that. If you've ever learned alongside other people or taught anybody, you know that people learn differently. But distance education, really more than face-to-face, has the potential to provide a variety of different learning experiences so that each learner can gravitate to the ones that best help him or her master whatever the outcomes are in a particular situation. It's easier to provide a variety of options in distance ed than it is in face-to-face, because you're not likely to be carrying the process through by delivering a live lecture to 300 people sitting in a lecture hall. You can't differentiate that very effectively, but that's not what distance education ideally is like along the way. One of the things that I didn't put in the readings, not part of our readings so far, but it's a term that you'll hear me use a lot, which is the term constructivism. It's a school of educational thought. What is constructivism? What do constructivists believe?
That like students construct their own learning. They kind of build on it as they go through the learning process.
Okay, as opposed to what might be some other theoretical or philosophical approaches to education that might be significantly different from constructivism. How would you sort of compare, contrast it, I guess, is one way of trying to go at it.
I guess maybe like, just a traditional lecture type of learning atmosphere. Whereas with this, like students could experiment with things and do projects and study on their own, watch videos, whatever, to kind of develop their own learning and their own ideas about things.
Yeah, constructivism. One of the better known quotes about constructivism is from Alan Kay, who was and is a major educational technology figure. He's actually the guy who invented the laptop. And he was another person associated with Xerox. But he said, to know the world, one must construct it, which in my head makes a great deal of sense. The idea is that as we learn stuff, we all put it together a little differently. We all organize it a little differently. We all find ways to remember stuff, different mnemonic devices, different visual images, different ways of understanding how pieces are connected or affect one another. And constructivism is kind of an educational school of thought that says the best way to help people learn is to focus on helping them build their own educational structures inside their head rather than focusing on getting them to memorize a structure that someone else has created. So the inside of everybody's head looks a little different. And the idea is to help everybody get their head well organized in ways that works for them in their particular context there. The reason that I mentioned constructivism is not because you must be a constructivist in order to do well in this class or even to be a good teacher. I'm very much a constructivist. So if you wonder, where's this guy coming from? That's where I'm coming from as far as how I approach education over time here. One of the things that I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about here is something that's coming up, assignments that are coming up in this class, because right about now, people generally start having a few questions. I know last week we had at least one question about badges, which is fine. But I wanted to mention the digital badge project and the MOOC project. It's not even necessary to get started on these yet, but both of them do take some time and both of them are highly individualized on your part. So I wanted to send up a flag and say, guys, don't forget this is coming. Pay attention and be prepared to do some slow advance work on this as it gets closer. The digital badge project is going to have you earn a digital badge of some kind. You get to choose which one. And Melissa, you asked last week. I double checked, and I do still have quite a few free sources for digital badges that are going to be there when you hit the digital badge project. I give you weeks and weeks and weeks to work on it. So you can look at all those sources and find some freebie ones that don't cost you anything. Now, the MOOC project, we haven't talked about MOOCs really yet, but MOOCs are massively open online courses. And massive in this case sometimes means tens of thousands of students in one course. They're a very different beast. They're not like this class. They're very much not like this class. Many of them, however, are free. And one of your assignments is actually going to be to complete a MOOC of your choosing. And I'll give you free sources for those too, so that you don't have to actually pay anything. One of the things that I really strongly encourage you to think about when you look at the MOOC project and make a choice is pick a subject that you're genuinely interested in for some reason. Doesn't have to be job related, although if you find a job related one, that's fine if you want to do a MOOC that's related to that. But for example, I did a MOOC on Scottish Gaelic that I wanted to learn. And it's a fascinating topic to me. I wanted to make it very clear that neither your digital badge that you earn nor the MOOC that you complete needs to be related either to the content of this class or to what you do professionally. You know, you want to do a MOOC about knitting furry animals? Okay, you know, that's your thing. That's fine. I'm interested in the MOOC experience, not the subject of the MOOC. And I'm interested in the badge experience, not the subject of the badge. So I encourage you to pick subjects in both cases that work for you, that you're interested in, that you care about, that you'd want to do anyway because you think it's cool, whatever that might be for you, because there's an enormous variety out there. So you might as well pick something that's fun and interesting while you're doing it. So I wanted to make that very clear as we approach. What I will do is I'll open up the digital badge project and the MOOC project weeks ahead of when they are due, so that you can go in there and look and think and make a pick. Don't procrastinate. And the reason I'm saying that is, for a lot of the digital badges, they require you to turn something into somewhere and get it evaluated and basically get a grade back. That takes time. Sometimes it can take a couple of weeks to get that information back. So I'll give you a lot more than 2 weeks to work with, but that's why you need to start early, so that you potentially can do that. And that 2 weeks isn't a problem for you as far as finishing the assignment. Same thing's true for a MOOC. I mean, some of them will last a whole semester, and I'm not asking you to do one that's that long, but I do typically ask you to do one that lasts at least 2 to 3 weeks for the MOOC. So if you're going to allow 2 to 3 weeks worth of time to be MOOCing, well, back up on the calendar here. If it's due on December 1st, start thinking about 3 or 4 weeks at least before that, so you have time to complete the MOOC before the assignment is due. It's not particularly difficult to do either of those things, but I just wanted to be very explicit about what a difference it makes if you'll be conscious of the time factor in doing those. If you'll take that particular advice to heart, they're fun and interesting and not difficult assignments at all. But I occasionally get panic-stricken students saying, "Oh no, this is due in 2 weeks and the MOOC is 3 weeks long. What do I do?" Well, the first thing you do is don't be in that situation. Why didn't you start 4 weeks ago? I told you about this. So let's not go there, okay? That's now that you know. Questions about either what we're doing so far in terms of content or the MOOC or badge projects here. We always have room for questions at the end of class.
Yeah, I will say I was looking into the digital badge and the MOOC, and there are some that are like 6 weeks, 8 weeks or something. And I said there was a lot that had to do with like software engineering. And it's like, I hope there's something out there other than that.
Don't do that, Melissa. If software engineering doesn't interest you, there are other options.
No. That's my husband's job, though. He can deal.
Okay, show him the badges and software engineering, and you go find a badge on something else. There are also a fair number of business-related ones. I know you're a small business person, so you might be able to find something that's closely related to your entrepreneurial activities that you're engaging in at this point. And that could be a good choice. Not that it has to be. Questions about Simonson, Stephen Johnson, distance education, badges, MOOCs? With people, you don't get as many questions. Okay, I don't have any other new content for you. So I think we're probably about done for this evening, and we're almost out of time anyway. By the way, I did want to tell you about something that I'm experimenting with at this particular point. Something that's bothered me for a long time in terms of Zoom sessions is the fact that since my camera normally is located at the top of my screen, as yours probably is also, which means that when I'm looking at the person that I'm talking to, I'm usually, it looks as though I'm looking down because the camera is up and I'm looking at the middle of the screen where you guys are. I recently got a camera on a stalk, and the camera that I'm using now is in the middle of my screen. And I have the impression, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I have the impression that this works a lot better as far as eye contact. I feel like I'm looking much more directly at you guys as students on the screen. I don't know if you get that impression as students at the other end or not, but at least from an instructor's perspective, it helps me. I feel like I'm looking directly at you instead of off to the side or up at the ceiling here. And for me, looking directly at my students is helpful in terms of thinking, I'm paying attention to you. I'm paying attention to your body language, your facial expressions, and I'm communicating directly with you rather than staring off into space and communicating with some disembodied entities out there somewhere. So I think
Does
that's
that-
pretty cool.
Does that cover
Yeah.
up part of your screen?
Say again?
Does that cover up part of your screen?
It's on a stalk. It's on a stalk that's about the thickness of a drinking straw. And there's a clamp at the top of the screen.
Oh, okay, I get
And
it.
there's
I
this
get
what
it.
looks like a black drinking straw coming halfway down my screen.
Oh,
And something sort of the size of the last joint of my little finger on the end of the stalk. And I can adjust it. I mean, I can point the camera, you can, this is the result of my turning the camera. And I can, move it up and down. So I can get it adjusted to just where I want it to be. I've been very pleased with that. I think it's, from an instructional standpoint, I think it was a worthwhile expenditure, just because I think it lets me have a more direct contact with my students at a distance. I like that part a lot. Distance education technology.
Have you ever seen Star Trek? Have you ever seen Star
Have
Trek?
I ever
the old-
seen Star Trek? I am old enough that I was born before Star Trek. So yes, but I've never seen the newer Star Treks. I was the original,
Okay.
crude
Well, when
Star Trek.
Scott, when they beam things up, beamed people up, there's a light in the back of your thing that goes in and out, and I just couldn't quit thinking, it's like, must be the ceiling light in your room.
It is.
It goes in and out, and I love
I'll
it.
turn it on
It
for
just
you.
makes me laugh.
It is that.
I love it.
I don't know if it'll. There's the ceiling.
Oh,
You can
there
see
it
the
is.
ceiling light a little
Yeah,
better.
there
with
it is. I love
on.
it
There
so much.
is. There it is. Now
You're
I'm beaming
glowing.
in. Yes.
Yes.
Or you could think of it as a halo, right? That would be an alternative explanation. All right.
I love
I think
it.
that's about it for this week. I'll stick around as always for a couple minutes in case anybody has individual questions for you. I'm going to turn off our recording.